city. If you believe strength only looks one way, if you've ever judged a book by its cover, or if you think you already know how this story ends, stop right now, hit subscribe, and stay with me. Because what you're about to hear shattered every assumption in a room full of America's toughest warriors, and it might change the way you see courage forever. And now the story begins. They laughed at her the moment she walked in. Not loudly at first, but with that low, confident amusement that only men who believe they are untouchable can manage. The kind of laughter that doesn't need permission because it assumes the world agrees. And the bar just outside Coronado had seen that laughter many times before, especially on Friday nights when Navy SEALs came in, fresh off rotations. Shoulders squared, bodies carved by salt water and discipline, voices carrying the weight of men who had survived things most people would never hear about, let alone see. And she stood out immediately. Not because she was loud or flashy, but because she wasn't supposed to be there, at least not according to the unspoken rules of the room, wearing a plain dark jacket, jeans, boots scuffed like they'd seen more miles than fashion magazines would approve of, hair pulled back without ceremony, posture relaxed, but alert in a way that didn't beg for attention. And when one of the SEALs glanced her way and snorted into his drink, muttering, "Useless lady," the others chuckled. The bartender raised an eyebrow but said nothing, and the woman didn't react at all. Not a flinch, not a glare, not even a sigh, as if she'd heard worse things in places far less friendly than a California bar. And that was the first twist no one noticed, because they were too busy underestimating her. Too busy filling the silence with stories of training hell weeks, of deployments that blurred together, of friends lost and enemies neutralized. Too busy believing that power announces itself loudly. And when she ordered water instead of alcohol, someone scoffed, because courage, to them, came with whiskey. And then the second twist slipped in quietly when a drunk civilian bumped into her chair and apologized to the SEALs instead of her. And she smiled at him, not sweetly, but knowingly, and shifted just enough to let him pass without spilling his drink. And that tiny movement, economical and precise, would have set off alarms in a different room, but here it went unnoticed, buried under bravado, until one of the SEALs, younger than the rest and eager to prove himself, decided to make a show of it, loudly asking if she was lost, if she was waiting for her boyfriend, if she knew where she was. And when she finally looked up, meeting his eyes with calm gray focus, she said evenly, "I know exactly where I am." And the table erupted in laughter, someone repeating, "Exactly where I am," in a mocking falsetto. And the bartender shifted uncomfortably now, because something in her voice didn't fit the joke. And then the night tilted when the power went out. Not completely, just a sudden flicker, lights dimming to emergency glow, music cutting mid-beat, the kind of thing that happens often enough that no one panics, except that in that half-second of uncertainty, muscle memory took over for her in a way it didn't for anyone else, and she moved, not dramatically, not violently, but decisively, sliding off the stool, positioning herself with her back to a structural column, eyes scanning exits, hands empty but ready. And when the lights steadied again, one of the SEALs froze mid-laugh because she wasn't where she'd been a moment before. And that shouldn't have bothered him as much as it did. But it did, because he hadn't seen her move. And SEALs pride themselves on seeing everything. And then the third twist arrived wearing the face of a threat when two men burst through. The door with weapons badly concealed and intentions not at all subtle, voices raised, adrenaline sloppy, the kind of criminals who mistake noise for control, and the bar collectively inhaled, chairs scraping, drinks spilling, someone shouting. And the SEALs were already moving, training kicking in, bodies turning, hands reaching. But before any of them could close distance, she was there. Not between them and the threat, but already past the first man. Her movement so smooth, it looked like luck. Her elbow driving into a nerve cluster with surgical accuracy, the weapon clattering to the floor. Her knee taking the second man's balance, her shoulder rotating him into the wall hard enough to knock the air out of his lungs without breaking his neck. And the bar went silent in the way only shock can produce. Because it wasn't just that she'd acted. It was how she'd done it. With restraint. With control. With the unmistakable signature of someone who had trained not to win fights, but to end them cleanly. And one of the SEALs muttered, "What the hell?" Not in anger, but awe. And the bartender stared, mouth open, and she raised her hands slowly, palms out, signaling calm, her breathing steady, eyes never leaving the downed men. And when the police arrived minutes later, She stepped back without being asked, gave a concise statement that said everything and nothing, declined medical attention, and returned to her seat as if she'd only gone to the restroom, and that should have been the end. But stories like this don't end where people expect, because once the danger passed, the questions rushed in, and the SEALs, to their credit, didn't double down on arrogance, not all of them, because the oldest at the table, a man with scars that spoke of decades of service, stood, walked over, and said quietly, "That was professional." And she looked up at him, studied him the way he studied her, and said, "So was your response time?" Almost. And instead of bristling, he laughed once, sharp and genuine, and asked what unit she was with. And that was the moment she shook her head and said, "None." And the room leaned in, because now the mystery was louder than the mockery had been. And she told them, without embellishment, about a life that ran parallel to theirs but rarely intersected, about black budget programs that didn't wear uniforms, about being recruited young because she didn't fit the mold, because she could disappear in places where men like them stood out, about operations that never made the news, about being the one sent in when deniability mattered more than flags. And as she spoke, the SEALs realized the real twist. Not that she was capable, but that she'd chosen anonymity, that she'd walked into their bar not to prove anything, not to challenge them, but because sometimes even ghosts want a quiet place to sit. And when the younger SEAL finally apologized, not loudly, not performatively, but sincerely, she nodded once, accepting it as currency spent. And when she stood to leave, the room parted without anyone asking. The bartender comped her drink she hadn't even finished, and outside, as the ocean air hit her face, she paused, hearing laughter resume behind her, different now, humbled, and she allowed herself a small smile, because the silence she'd created wasn't about fear, it was about recognition. And the final twist, the one no one inside ever knew, was that she'd already put in her resignation weeks earlier, that this was her last night living that life, that tomorrow she'd board a plane, not to a mission, but to a future she'd earned. And as she walked away, the bar returned to normal. But every SEAL in that room carried something new with them, a reminder that strength doesn't announce itself, that usefulness isn't loud, and that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one no one bothers to notice.